Hello, thank you for being here with me today. My name is Stephanie. I'm going to be your host for this episode. Today, we are going to be talking about a case that had a really big impact on me. It's the epitome of why we teach stranger danger, why we explain to children not to allow strangers to get too close to them, or blindly trust what they have to say, and especially never to follow them to or get into a vehicle with them. But actually, this case is two cases. We will be talking about two girls who never crossed paths in life, but ended up being intertwined with each other. We're going to be going back to 1993 in St. Louis County, Missouri, to go over the disappearance and investigation of 9-year-old Angie Housman and 10-year-old Cassidy Center. These girls lived miles apart from each other. They had both disappeared near their homes in broad daylight and then found just over a week after their disappearance. We're going to follow the investigation as it unfolded and go over why one of these cases was solved in a matter of months, while the other spent nearly 3 decades being a mystery with very little hope of even being solved. Before fully jumping in, though, I would like to advise that we are talking about real people. These are real crimes, and today specifically, we're focused on children, so there will be disturbing mentions such as sexual assault, torture, pedophilia, and other related topics. This is a heavy case, and listener discretion is strongly advised. But for the full picture, we're going back to the beginning. So it's 1993, and it's been a whole year for the Midwest. There was the Great Flood of 93, where the Midwest had severe flooding in several states, starting as early as April. And over the months, it had caused $12 to $16 billion of damage across all of the states that it had affected. This flood had a massive impact on communities, farmers, and a lot of people had lost their homes. And for the St. Louis area, waters had only dropped below flood stages in early October. And by that time, national news had already switched its focus to the ongoing search for Polly Klaas in California. But California, that's a long way from Missouri. You know, kids go missing, but that's not here. That's not our home. Which is such a common mindset. Even when it happens, it's hard to wrap your head around something so terrible, right? Like, it's easier to be able to distance yourself and explain why this couldn't be you or your friend, your neighbor, your child. But this November kicks off a string of events that would forever change that mindset in this area of Missouri. It was said a lot, especially then, that this is when the community lost its innocence. It's when kids stopped being able to be kids. And it first started with an attempted abduction in Maryland Heights. Early in the month of November, a young girl, only 10, hops off her school bus, and on her familiar walk home, she's grabbed off of the sidewalk, pulled into some bushes by a much older man, and is assaulted sexually. Thankfully, she was able to get away and run home to tell her parents what had happened. When the police arrived, they were able to get a sketch of the man and started looking into catching who was responsible. A little over a week after this is when things really escalated with Angie. Angie Housman was a 9-year-old girl born February 18th of 1984. She lived in St. Anne, Missouri, which is only about 4 miles from Maryland Heights, with her 2-year-old brother, her mother Diane, and her stepfather Ron, who had actually been a father to her since she was about 2 herself. Since, after only getting the chance to hold Angie a few times after she was born, her biological father, D'Angelo, had separated from Diane and was told to stay away from Angie completely, even though after the separation, until Ron had come into the picture, he was financially supporting them. And as far as I could tell, no one's made it clear exactly why he wasn't allowed to be in her life. Still, though, by all accounts, it was easy for Angie to let Ron in. I read this cute story that Ron had told about the first time he met Angie. He said that she had come over and just sat on his lap and was like, "Hey, Daddy." And he was like, "Well, I guess I'm a dad now." And she really looked at him like that, since that was the figure that she had. And that makes sense with who Angie is. She's this little girl who's very social. She absolutely loved making friends, and she was very outgoing. Like, she could just walk up to anyone and start a conversation. One of the quoted lines that she would say is, "Hi, I'm Angie. Are you my friend?" And just like that, she made a friend. It didn't matter if it was kids at school, someone in line at the grocery store, or a neighbor just out for a walk in the neighborhood. No one was off limits for her. And a lot of people agreed that those little conversations that they would have with her left them feeling a little bit better about their day, left them a little brighter. She had this very fun personality, always running and dancing around with this big smile on her face. The kind of smile that went all the way up to her eyes. And you could see it in all of the pictures of her. She had this long, beautiful, wavy hair. And she was so small. She was such a little girl, she was just 9. So she was under 5 foot and hardly weighed a thing. And of course, like most 90s kids, she loved being outside, especially in the warmer months. Oftentimes, you'd find her riding her bike that she had won in a contest up and down the road while listening to the latest rock hits on her favorite radio station. Most days, it was usual for her to get home from school, run inside, drop her backpack off at the front door by the couch, and run right back out to play with the other kids in the neighborhood. It was like that spot was reserved for her book bag. I mean, so much so that on November 18th, its absence was one of the first things that Ron had noticed when he got home from work. And that day, it started out usual, right? I mean, Diane had been up all night with her 2-year-old child, but she still got Angie up for school, who had her bowl of cereal before grabbing her little pink coat and heading out to her bus stop. If anything, the biggest difference may have been in the classroom, with that little extra excitement surrounding the upcoming break for Thanksgiving, or just the fact that that meant Christmas was that much closer. It's what happened after school. This day would later be referred to as the perfect storm, or an example of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. After Angie had got off her normal bus stop that she had gotten off at, every day after school at 4 o'clock, she was walking home alone, since her usual group of neighborhood friends didn't take the bus that day. And the neighborhood was unusually quiet. There was a neighbor who would normally walk their dog around this time that had chosen to stay in with the weather being too cold out. And then there were other neighbors who normally watched from their porches or their windows to make sure that the children got home safely, and they were all gone, either at appointments or out with their family. So no one knew why Angie didn't make it down the block. No one knew why her bag wasn't laying at the front door over an hour after she was supposed to arrive home. And like I said, Ron noticed right away that that bag wasn't there. When he had gotten home from work and noticed that there was no sign of Angie in the house, he had woke Diane, who overslept after finally getting the baby to sleep around noon, and they quickly went out looking for her. Initially pretty positive, thinking that she had just gone to a friend's house without stopping at home first, but the worry was sinking in more and more after each answered door had a version of the same gut punch. Angie's not here. As Ron and Diane asked around, neighbors joined the search, some walking in the streets in the neighborhood, while others got in their cars and were driving around the roads searching for any sign of her. This had gone on for about 2 hours, and it's now about 7 o'clock, 3 hours after Angie should have been home, when a neighbor sees a policeman patrolling the area and flags him down to let him know about Angie being missing. And he immediately calls this in and has more officers come out to start a formal search. And from the start with this, the police took it very seriously. I mean, Angie didn't have any behavioral issues. She didn't have any recent fights at home. So with her being gone for hours at her age, they treated this as a missing persons case almost immediately. By the early hours of the following day, they already had helicopters out searching parks and creeks in the area. They had brought out scent dogs who were able to pick up Angie's scent and followed it from her bus stop and about halfway home. So it was just 4 houses down from where she lived when it just stopped. But trying to piece together what happened was difficult. I mean, there were no clues, there were no witnesses, and they weren't even sure if her trail had stopped where it did because she had gotten into a car, or if it was something like the wind had just blown her scent away. Over the following days, missing persons posters were created with Angie's 4th grade school photo. She had her hair up in this really poofy, like 90s style with this blue flowery top on, and that smile I was talking about that went all the way up to her eyes. They had them posted all around town. And police were right at work, extensively interviewing and re-interviewing Ron and Diane. They even had Ron do a lie detector test. But the both of them were very understanding that they had to be interviewed, even if it was just to be ruled out as suspects. Other progress included the FBI and the Major Case Squad of St. Louis being brought in, which was kind of a big deal. I mean, usually the Major Case Squad had only worked on homicide cases, and they had a very small window that they would even work on cases. But they did have a very high success rate when it came to solving crimes, although it was unusual for them to be working on a missing persons or abduction case. But the police maintained at this time that they were looking for Angie alive. They just recognized that they needed to set their pride aside and take all of the help that they could get when the stakes are this high, which I think is such a great and refreshing thing to hear. But even though they were accepting help from other departments, they still had no witnesses or really any evidence or clues from Angie's neighborhood. The police were getting a lot of tips over the phone. Just after a few days, they had received hundreds of calls from people in the area. And even when questioning people who knew Angie, there wasn't a whole lot that came up, although a gym teacher did say that Angie had told them she was going to be going on a trip with her uncle that coming weekend, only a day before she disappeared, which this is such a mystery. She had an uncle, but he had drowned a few years before this, and there were no trips planned with the family. So even now, in 2025, nobody knows who or what she was talking about when she had told her teacher this. Other than that, though, around this time, there were also psychics calling in. There was one that had talked with Angie's family directly and told them something like Angie was alive and well, and she wanted to come home, but she was afraid that she would get in trouble and get spanked, which prompted the family to go and do a broadcast pleading for Angie to come home and assuring her that she wasn't going to be in any trouble, which for me, I don't know, it just feels a little gross. You know, this family is worried sick. They're listening to anything and everything they're being told. And I mean, her mom, understandably, was losing herself. There was at one point where she had been so tired and she just couldn't or she wouldn't sleep, that the police had actually medicated her just so that she would be able to sleep and cooperate if they had any questions or anything for her. I know I don't know enough about psychics to have a real opinion on it, but there was something about this that just hurt my heart so much. I hated it. But moving on from that, almost a week after Angie's disappearance, the police had gotten America's Most Wanted to do a broadcast about Angie. They even sent an officer down to D.C. to field phone calls in relation to tips that would come in with that. Meanwhile, police continued their investigations, interviewing anyone that could be potential suspects, which at this time was still everyone, and they weren't taking any chances ruling anyone out, even the family. But following the various leads and tips that were coming in by phone and searching all sorts of areas around St. Louis and St. Charles County in the freezing temperatures with the hopes of returning Angie back to her family safely, days continued to pass, and it seemed like they weren't getting any closer to finding where Angie was. That is until November 27, 9 days after Angie didn't make it home, police received a call from a deer hunter, directing them to the heavily wooded area of Bush Wildlife in St. Charles County, Missouri, about 15 miles away from Angie's home, after he had stumbled upon the body of a young girl lying on her back, partially covered in ice and snow, handcuffed and tied to a tree. Once police arrived at the scene, they pretty quickly put together that this young girl was Angie. Although her hair was now cut and dyed a different color, there was a blue and white book bag, the book bag that was supposed to be by the couch, containing school books that had the name Angie written on the inside covers, as well as her clothes. And there was a separate bag that held torn up pieces of her underwear, with the missing pieces being stuffed into her mouth under some gaffer's tape, which also covered her eyes and other deep cuts on her body. It was apparent that Angie was left out in the woods while she was still alive. You could see these heel marks in the dirt where she had been using her feet to try to get away. which an autopsy did verify that this was Angie, and she had died of hypothermia just hours before she had been found, meaning while everyone was searching high and low for her, she was being held captive. She had been violently sexually assaulted and showed no signs that she received food or water during her time in captivity. It's horrific. And to top it off, as far as leads with the crime scene, there really weren't a lot. They were able to get a few partial fingerprints from the tape that was on her, but it wasn't enough to put into APHIS, or the fingerprint database. It was only clear enough to compare to a suspect if interviewed. Then there was some DNA that was found, but it didn't provide any results. And the area that Angie had been found in was an area that high schoolers or older teens would frequent to drink and hang out. So there were a lot of beer bottles around the area that were collected and tested for DNA. When Angie's aunt was asked, looking back on this day, she said that all she could remember was when she heard the news of a young girl that was found, her sister, Diane, denying that it was Angie, screaming, "It's not her, it's not her." But this is when the case for her missing daughter was changed to a homicide investigation. By December 2nd, friends and family were grieving and laying Angie to rest in a pink dress with a white beaded necklace. They had given her a little pocket Bible, pictures of her family, and a small teddy bear, dressed in a Santa outfit that her stepfather Ron had said was so that she'd have Christmas all year round. And while everybody was saying their final goodbyes, doing a balloon release for Angie and listening to some of her favorite songs, there was another family across town in Hazelwood, only 5 miles away, holding their breath as police continued questioning neighbors and searching for their little girl who had just gone missing the day before. And this is where Cassidy Center comes in. Cassidy went by Cassie. She was born June 9th of 1983, and she was a mama's girl. She loved her mom so much. They had spent a lot of time together. When her parents separated, she stayed with her mom. Cassie was a member of the Girl Scouts of America, and she loved going to church. She had this curly brown hair and this little crown of freckles that went across her nose and under her eyes. When she smiled, you could see it. It went all the way up her face, and her eyes would curve into this little crescent shape. And she was just adorable. Her neighbors had said that her favorite color must have been pink. They were always seeing her wear something pink, whether it was pants, sweaters, something. She always seemed to be happy, walking around with this cheery smile on her face when she was out in the neighborhood, which was pretty often. She loved hanging out with her friends in the area, which she was pretty new to. Her mom and her had just moved there with a family friend, Mike, back in July, about 5 months earlier, after their home had been burned down. But it didn't seem like it was a bad change for Cassie. I mean, she still loved going to school. She loved seeing all of her friends at school. And like I said before, there were the kids in her new neighborhood, and she would go out and play with them often. Rhonda had always allowed Cassie to walk alone in the neighborhood. It had never really been an issue. And Cassie was a really good and really responsible kid. She was so independent that at just 10, she was able to walk alone, keep track of time, and always be home right when she was supposed to, and always in before it got dark out. She even had this little yellow personal alarm that her mom had got her. It had this little pin in it that you could pull out, and it would make this really loud, obnoxious beeping noise, with the idea that it would get others' attention in a just-in-case kind of scenario. And Cassie would take that everywhere with her whenever she would leave the house alone, ever since her mom bought it for her. Even on December 1st, when Cassie left, Mike had actually checked her personal alarm to make sure that it was working before she had left the house. That day, Cassie had plans to go over to her friend's home to set up Christmas lights. Her mom actually had plans at 5 o'clock, so she wasn't going to be able to stay over there long. But even for a short amount of time, she wanted to go over there and hang with them as long as she was able to. Before she left, she had called the friends that she had made plans with to let them know that she would be over in about 15 to 20 minutes and got permission from Mike and had her alarm checked. And then she headed out with the plan of being home by 5 p.m. So when 5 o'clock came around, Mike and Rhonda were a little worried. Cassie was always home on time, so it was unusual that she wasn't back yet. 10 after, when Rhonda called the family she was with to make sure that Cassie was on her way home and didn't forget or just lose track of time, that they knew something was very wrong and called the police immediately when they had found out that Cassie never made it to her friend's home. When the police had got there, they had brought out a bloodhound to try to track where Cassie was, and it followed her scent from her home and about a block away from her friend's house that she was planning to visit. And it changed direction, running through somebody's yard, out into the woods, through a field. But following that whole trail, there was no sign of Cassie. But Cassie's mom knew something was wrong because Cassie never would have gone into those woods by herself. First, she was afraid of the dark, and she was afraid of the woods. She thought they were creepy. She was 10. She wasn't running out into these dark, spooky woods. You don't know what could be out there. She was supposed to be hanging Christmas lights. There's no way that this is some kind of joke or that she would have had any reason to run off into those woods. And that worry was confirmed when police began questioning neighbors and found out that Cassie's little yellow personal alarm was found a block from where she was supposed to be going. They had found it about 10 minutes after Cassie had left the house because the alarm was loud and it was beeping. It was annoying. So neighbors found it pretty quickly. And I know this is one of those things that I find so annoying. But if I am being honest, I don't know. Put myself back into 1993, would I have known what this was? Would I have known what to be looking for? But the neighbors that found this didn't know what it was. It was just this annoying device that they had found in their yard near the street. And so they taped it up, trying to quiet it down. And when that didn't work, when it was still so loud over the tape that they had wrapped it in, they actually just buried it in the yard. And when police came around and started questioning neighbors, that's when it kind of sank in for them. They put that together and oh my God, we found this. This is the time we found it. This is where we found it, dug it up and gave it to the police. And like I said, this is when panic really set in for Rhonda and Mike. They knew something was terribly wrong. They knew that that pin on the alarm would not have been fooled if Cassie wasn't in trouble. She knew what it was for, and she knew how to use it. She was a responsible kid. This was not an accident, some kind of mistake. She didn't drop it and just leave it in the street. And she wasn't the kind of kid that would pull some kind of prank like this, pulling on her alarm and running off and hiding in the woods. This case looked like an abduction very quickly, but the police were trying to stay positive. And I think trying to prevent any hysteria in the area. So in their initial first statements, they were saying that they weren't sure if a crime had even happened at all. All they had right now was a missing girl, but still, police had pleaded in a news conference that day for whoever had Cassie to consider the family and release her immediately, which very much sounds like they knew she was kidnapped. They knew that something else was going on. This was not a runaway. But the search for Cassie had gone on all night. There weren't any other clues that turned up, and by the second day, they had helicopters out looking for her. Police kept up with the search, even going through the bush wildlife area again, and started looking at the possibility that these cases could be connected. The major case squad had picked up and assisted with Cassie's case as well, and soon, just like with Angie's case, days had gone by since Cassie had been seen. And even with the long search hours and hundreds of tips coming in by phone, all the interviews, all the re-interviews, nothing was turning up. They weren't getting any closer. Then after 8 days of searching, December 9th, 2 teenagers cutting through an alley had noticed this blanket that stood out from all the broken bottles, the old tires, and other trash discarded here. And it stood out because this blanket was not trash. This blanket was wrapped around the badly beaten body of Cassidy Jacqueline Center. These boys had run to the closest payphone to call the police and get them out there as soon as they could be. When the police arrived, they had found Cassie's body wrapped in comforters and a sheet. She had been tied up with her pants pulled down and her shirt pulled up to her neck. And it was very apparent just by looking at her that something very, very violent happened. And really, what she went through was brutal. An autopsy had determined that she had died of blunt force trauma, and Cassie had lived through a lot of the attack. She really suffered with this. She had a lot of defensive wounds and bruises that just covered her body. And on her head, she had at least 5 big impacts that could have been the one that caused her death. An autopsy also concluded that she had died within an hour after leaving her home. Later said that she had died within 10 minutes of even being abducted. So before the cops could begin looking for her, before her mom even knew that she had been missing. And as far as evidence, with Cassie, there was more to go off of with this crime scene. They had found hair fibers and paint chips on her body and the blankets. They even had some surveillance video from a nearby store that was really low quality, right? It was very grainy. You couldn't really see what was going on. But they were able to make out that there was some kind of big white van backing into the lot the night before Cassie had been found. And this van had left tire tracks that led from the street to Cassie's body. So police had begun running tests and continued with their investigation. Meanwhile, Cassie had her funeral. It was held at the church that she had gone to, Praise Temple Church, and over 400 people had attended. The reverend there, that Cassie actually called him Grandpa. They were very close. He had said that she would have been honored and just thrilled to know that she had drawn in the largest crowd that this church, that she loved very, very much, had ever seen. Her Aunt Darla also spoke very positively about all of the help and the work that was put in for helping find Cassie and how the community really came together, and it really showed her just how much people still care. And I think that is something that could be a little bit of a takeaway. You know, if your community experiences some kind of loss like this, just showing up, being supportive, putting your time in can go a long way. But now there was a second young girl being buried, and the community was panicked. It was really starting to set in. Parents weren't letting kids out of their sight. I mean, even parents of kids younger, little boys, they weren't allowed out of their parents' sight either. They had started using the buddy system whenever going anywhere. Schools and the police had launched safety campaigns. Schools had volunteers that would carry these bright-colored umbrellas to signal that they were a trusted adult if a child needed any help. But who is hurting these little girls? Is this a serial killer? Is there even a chance that more than one murdering child predator lived on these streets? Every interview with every agency involved, they maintained that they were keeping an open mind, that these killings might not be related. The detectives all seemed to have their own opinion, some saying it was a gut feeling, others stating that statistically, you wouldn't have 3 or 4 different people in one area committing crimes like this at the same time. Others believed that it had to be multiple men, saying that in order to grab the girls, force them into a car without drawing any attention to themselves in the middle of the day, it had to be more than one person. I know at one point the FBI had posed a question to the detectives like, what is the likelihood and what are the chances that there are 2 people that don't have any connection to each other could abduct and kill 2 girls in a community this size, which the detectives had said that they felt like there was a greater likelihood that this was only one person. But they acknowledged that making a call like that at the same time, it wasn't an exact science. I believe they were pretty confident for a time, at least, that they were looking for just one guy. And I mean, really, they were. That'll come up later. But a lot of the community was thinking the same thing. And how could anyone not? With the proximity to each other and them being so close in age and looks, them being missing for days before being found, And at this time, the police were only saying that they had died a very violent death. So yeah, just off of that information, it sounds like these were definitely connected. And the community speculation only grew greater when the major case squad actually formed a new team that involved a serial killer expert and announced that they would be working on the cases until they were solved. Following that, the FBI had drawn up a profile for their suspected killer. The profile was that the killer was most likely white, between the ages of 20 to 45, and that they were intelligent, speculating that they were probably toying with police, wanting Cassie to be found sooner, which is why she was in a more public area rather than being out in a wooded area like Angie had been. They also have that they likely recently started living alone or had a recent stress, like losing a job or a family member, and that they would not get along well with the women. Some other points are that they were likely a loner, they had a menial job, something that wouldn't require a lot of intelligence to be shown, and that they would have several vehicles or rent several vehicles to avoid detection, ending the profile with a prediction that the killer will attack again. And police, they were getting calls all day with tips, some useful, but it did seem like everyone was starting to call in on any little thing that they thought was suspicious. Like, based off of the profile, there were people calling in on their coworkers. If their coworker ate alone during lunch, they were being called on. A neighbor had called because of these loud noises they were hearing next door, swearing that somebody was using a chainsaw day and night in the next door apartment. There was a woman who called in about her neighbor that she had sometimes seen walk by his window wearing a dress. And there were ex-boyfriends that were calling in on their ex's new boyfriends, saying that they were suspicious and that they should be looked at. And after the information about the van was released, they were getting a lot of calls, especially around lunchtime, when people were calling in just because they were seeing a white van out and about, which I think just speaks to how alarmed and scared the community was, right? Like, some of these things just sound ridiculous. Like, I've ate lunch alone plenty of times, and your ex is moving on, so you think this other guy's suspicious, but, it's just everyone was on such a high alert. It really was like everyone was suspicious. One wrong move that you did or one thing that made somebody think twice, it would get them called in because everybody was looking for this monster that was living among them. And we all know that monsters aren't real. So it literally could be anyone. By mid-December, everyone working on the cases were working really hard. Still pulling 18-hour shifts. Their vacation and time off had been canceled, but they were really dedicated to getting these solved. And things were looking really good. By December 18th, it was announced that there had been an arrest made. Gary Stufflebean, an ex-resident of St. Louis, had been arrested in connection with the attempted abduction that had taken place just over a week before Angie had disappeared. He matched the sketch that was released, and he even fit some of the points in the profile. And even though by the end of December, Stufflebean had been officially charged with the attempted kidnapping and had a trial date set, this was not the end, because very quickly, police were put back to square one when he was cleared of being a suspect for both Angie and Cassie's kidnapping and subsequent deaths. I mean, he wasn't even in town by the time either of them had gone missing, and that left them with no strong suspects for either girl's case. Still, though, the investigation continued. Police had started going back over all of the evidence after the arrest to ensure that nothing had been missed. Police had been working with a teenager that would frequent that area that Angie had been found in, trying to get any information that he may have, and even looked at the possibility that another murder that occurred back in October could have been related. Tip lines were still being called, but they did start slowing down a lot. By the end of January, detectives had interviewed hundreds of pedophiles and questioned convicted murderers and rapists, which did help solve a lot of other assaults and thefts in the area. But a lot of the stuff that they had looked into seemed to lead to dead ends. But good news broke again in February of 1994 when there was another arrest. And this arrest actually all started with a neighbor's complaint, right? When re-interviewing Cassie's neighbors, one had asked the detectives, although it wasn't exactly what they were out looking for, they wanted to know if police would be able to do anything about their damaged mailbox. Like, their mailbox had been hit by a guy that lived across the street from them when he had rented a U-Haul truck a few weeks back, which sounds innocent enough, right? Like, I'm sure not everyone here has had a neighbor back into their mailbox, but it's not that unusual of an incident. But U-Hauls are white and orange, and the paint chips that were found on Cassie's body were white and orange. The van on the video that left the tire tracks to Cassie's body very well could have been a U-Haul truck. So police went and they had gotten records to confirm that one of the residents did rent a U-Haul. And, they did, but I mean, that's not proof, right? Just because you happen to be moving something the same night that a killer relocates a body, that doesn't make you guilty. That can't make you guilty. So detectives start a new round of interviews, this time with the focus being on Thomas Brooks, a 27-year-old who was on parole after serving an 8-year sentence for armed burglary, who had already been interviewed and had an established alibi that he had been at work at the time that Cassie had been murdered. But this new round of interviews uncovered that Brooks was not at work. He was at home. There was a DNA test that was performed that confirmed the hair that was found on Cassie's body matched Brooks. And the police had searched his home that he had been living at, and they had found a blood stain in the basement that matched Cassie's blood. They had also found a bed slab that consisted with something that could have been the weapon that caused the injuries to Cassie, which is just like that little board that you would put under a mattress that like keeps it flat. And I know we've already gone over the autopsy as far as the attack, so we're not going to go into those details, just the events that had led up to and after. But I do want to clarify that in the autopsy, there was no sign that Cassie had been sexually assaulted, just before we go over everything. Because I know that the way that things sound and the way that it's reported, the way her clothes were when she was found, it's weird. It seems like that would have been something, and it does seem like that was the motive. Anyway, we'll get into this. But Brooks, of course, initially he denied any involvement. And then once some of the evidence was presented against him, he did eventually confess to police that he had killed Cassie. And his story, it changed multiple times, right? Initially, he was claiming that she had come over to his house to play with his nephews. And then she just went up to him while he was in the basement. She took off all of her clothes and asked him to have sex with her, which led him to killing her because he just thought that she would say he was trying to sexually assault her, which is crazy. This is absolutely crazy to me. Like, in what world does that story even sound like something that could have happened? And I mean, when this went to trial, there was a police officer that was testifying to what Brooks had initially said, and that was the first time that Rhonda had heard this. Cassie's mother, she had actually got up in the courtroom and yelled at him. She was like, "You will burn for this. You will burn for this." And she had been taken out of the courtroom, but Brooks' attorney had tried to have a mistrial because of this. He was even like, "Yeah, I understand why she said that, and I understand where she's coming from. It's just not fair to my client, so we should have a mistrial." And yeah, thankfully the judge was like, "Absolutely not. We are not doing that. We are moving forward." And it's actually something that's been sourced in It was like over 200 cases the last time I had looked at it as something to support not having a mistrial based on a family member's outburst if the information coming out is especially upsetting like this. And I mean, that's disgusting. She was hearing for the first time this guy saying that her daughter, her 10-year-old daughter, was saying those things. His story did change some more. Where he finally landed was saying that Cassie had come over to his house to play with his nephews and went over the details of saying that he had grabbed her by her hand when she got to the door. He dragged her down the basement steps, which she fell down, and that's when her alarm had activated. Brooks took the alarm from her. He went back upstairs, threw it out onto the street, and then returned to the basement where he had told her to pull her pants down. She did not comply with this. Instead, she was screaming. She was looking for any way out of that basement. And he decided, again, that he would kill her with the same reason, fearing for himself that she would turn him in. So he attacked her. He called his coworker after the fact to clock him in at work and let him know that he was going to be on his way, and then took a taxi to work. Which, Brooks, he didn't have a car. So a lot of the times when he went to work, he would actually cut through those woods and through that field, and then his job was on that street there, which is likely why dog was able to follow that scent through the woods and through that field. I think it is more likely that he went and grabbed her off of the street. I mean, we know that Cassie already had plans with her friends to go set up Christmas lights. She was very excited for that. You know, she already wasn't going to have a lot of time to go and do that. And it's something she really wanted to do. So she was headed over to her friend's house. She had established plans. I don't think that there was any way that she had approached this other house, even if she had been friends with his nephews. I don't think that she would have been approaching the house at all. I think that he had gone outside. He had grabbed her at the street and pulled her into the house. And I think that she had pulled her alarm right away. And he probably threw it like from his yard out into the neighbor's yard where it landed kind of near the street next door. But anyway, I mean, after he had called his coworker to clock him in and he went into work, he had gone into work like it was any other day. And the following day, oh my God, and be prepared for this because this is just even more insane. His sister came up to him and she told him that she did not want to know anything about the body that was in her basement, but she wanted him to get rid of it, which is so disgusting to me. When I read that, I was like, I cannot believe that a mother of kids around Cassie's age would act this way. It just makes it feel even more heartless. And I know it's hard to put yourself in a mental situation like this. Like, what would I do if I were in their shoes? But in no way can I imagine that I could just ignore something like that. I cannot live with that. That would be on my conscience forever. I couldn't. Oh my God. We're going to move on because this just bothers me so much. And I'm just going to keep telling you that it's gross and I hate them. But, you know, after this, it's almost self-explanatory, right? He had hid Cassie's body behind a freezer in the basement. And when the smell of decomposition started becoming too strong a few days later, he had rented a U-Haul truck to move the body with the help of another person that was living with him. But, you know, like I mentioned before about him likely going and grabbing her off of the street and not having her come up to the door, he really maintained that that was part of the story. Like, he didn't kidnap her, but he was found guilty of armed criminal action, kidnapping, and attempted forcible rape. And with that, he had been sentenced to death by lethal injection. Although Brooks died in prison on May 16th of 2000 from an undisclosed illness before the injection could have ever been carried out. And there were also charges that were brought against his sister, Cassandra Quinn, as well as their roommate, LaFrance Wilson, who had lied to the police on several occasions. They were both charged with 2 felony accounts of hindering prosecution. But after this arrest, just like with Stufflebean, the police quickly realized that Brooks didn't have anything to do with Angie's disappearance. This was very much an opportunity attack. And this is also when some more questions had come up about the profile that was created, since Brooks was not white, which is what everyone was expecting the killer to be, because that's what was in the profile. So I think a lot of people were just taken aback that there was a Black man that had done one of these crimes. It's just like what I said, it's just not what they were expecting. And that's not what people were looking for. That's when it was reported that the profile that had been created was under the assumption that they were looking for a serial killer, that only one person was going to be responsible for these murders and even the attempted abduction. So although they were maintaining the entire time they were keeping an open mind, it is clear that they were really hooked on this serial killer thing. I mean, the profile that they were using to go into these investigations looking for people, and who knows like how they were determining who to interview, if that had a big impact on it, because I'm sure that it did. I know they were keeping an open mind and there would have been other people in that pool, but I do think a lot of them were really hoping that it was one person, because I mean, really, that would have been the best case scenario, right? With Cassie, there was a lot more physical evidence to go off of, and I think that might have made it a lot easier to focus some manpower on finding her killer. And this isn't supposed to be a dig at the detectives. I mean, I know a lot of them really did believe they weren't connected, and a lot of them were focused on like the two people idea as well. It's not like everyone was set to just work on Cassie's case. Both of the cases were being worked on. But I'm sure between both teams, there was a strong mindset of like, once this one's solved, we've got it. They're off the street and it's done. So as far as Angie's case went after this, there was an update on February 10th where a sketch had been released of a man wanted for questioning that had been seen driving around the area of Angie's neighborhood around the time that she had gone missing. But they did assure everyone in this release that this man was not a suspect. He was just wanted for questioning. And the police had numerous tips about who this could have been, but nothing came out of it. And things started getting quieter and quieter about the case until it turned into small updates and anniversary articles. Some of the most notable things would be that on September of 1994, the police did receive satellite images from bush wildlife around the time that Angie may have been left there. But with that, it really turned out to be nothing since it was very cloudy that week. A lot of the pictures just looked like smoke. Like it really, you weren't able to see anything in it. And the ones that were clear, they weren't able to find anything out with them. They were really hoping to get an image of like a vehicle or maybe even be able to obtain a license plate number. And of course, there was the year anniversary update with Diane, Angie's mom, where she had been interviewed and talked about how some mornings she would still yell out to Angie that it's time for school and immediately think back to herself, like, what am I doing? Which is so heartbreaking, thinking about how she had to relive that remembering that her daughter was no longer there. She no longer had a little girl to get off to school in the morning. Also in the interview, she had talked about how she would watch the other kids walk home from her living room window, worrying whenever she saw someone walking alone. Like, it's not safe out there. She'd have these little panics about it. Like a lot of days, though, she had to close the blinds in her living room. Even when it was a nice and sunny day, she just couldn't let any of that in because of, on top of all the anxiety she would get from seeing other kids walking home alone, she could see that spot where the dog trail stopped. She could see the spot where Angie disappeared from, and it broke her. After this update, there was a lot of silence for a few years. There had been a false confession made, but it was determined that the person making this confession was doing it for notoriety. All of the information that he had given to police was stuff that was publicly released, and when asking more details that only the killer would know for information that wasn't released, they didn't get any of that stuff correct. What I think is more substantial, though, was the deathbed confession of Brian Squires. He had made a deathbed confession to make peace with God before he had died. He had confessed to a nurse, to 2 child abductions and murders, one being Angie's, the other being one that he was the prime suspect in. And not only that, most of the information that he had given to her and that was able to be relayed to the police was verified to be true. But the police never got to talk to Squires about this, as the nurse didn't even report this for over a year because the stories that he told her were so horrible that she didn't believe that they could have been true, that something like that could have happened. After this, sometime in the 2000s, there was a group that was started by some women in the community. They called themselves Angie's Angels, and they did a lot of their own investigative work on this, questioning neighbors, people that were involved in the case, and family members, anyone that might have more information or any clues on what happened to Angie and who was responsible for it. I did want to mention them because I think it is very obvious that they care a lot about Angie. They cared a lot about this case. They care a lot about the community. And even though I don't personally think that they were going about things the right way, it really sounded like they were a bit pushy with police, wanting things to be released that the police didn't want released. This case was never a cold case. It was always open, so more information was not released. They were holding that stuff very close to the chest so that when something came up, they would be able to have a case against whoever did this. But I think, it had been years, right? From 1993 to the 2000s, it had almost been a decade. So I think it's reasonable why they went about it how they did. I just wanted to give them a little shout out because they really cared a lot. And, they'd be a much different part of this story if they were the ones that found that thing that connected the murderer to Angie. But we are going to be jumping to January of 2003. And I know this is going to sound like I am taking you down a whole new path, super off topic, but I promise this is on topic. Just to get full clarity on what kind of person we're dealing with, we got to talk about Brenda. Brenda is a 14-year-old girl. She's from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and she loved going into those chat rooms online. There was this teen flirt chat room that she especially liked going to, and that's where she met Earl, or Young Stuff, as he went by online. They had started chatting back in November of 2002, which very quickly turned into her having these really inappropriate conversations with him, where he revealed that he wanted to sleep with this underage girl. Right, I did mention Young Stuff from the teen flirt chat room is an shocker here. Not a teen at all. He's actually like 45, but nonetheless, eventually, once January came around, the time had come for them to finally meet. Earl had given Brenda encouragement to run away from home and come and be with him, where he'd be able to do all the dirty things he had promised her over the past few months. And she was so excited. She got dressed up exactly how he asked her to, took the $60 he had sent her to take a bus from Virginia to Colorado and meet him at the McDonald's near the bus stop she was dropped off at. And we all know how this goes, right? They introduce themselves, and Earl, he looks at Brenda, looks her up and down, and says, "Well, you don't look 14. And that's because Brenda is not 14. Brenda's not even Brenda. He'd been chatting up and attempting to groom an undercover federal agent. And that's when Earl Webster Cox was arrested. And during a search of his home, they went through his computer and found out that he was actually helping run and administrate an international child pornography ring on the dark web. And this was huge. This was something that other agencies were actively working on infiltrating and facing a lot of difficulties with how highly sophisticated the security around the site was. And now they had access to a person who helped run it and their computer. So as early as July of 2003, there was a sting that led to over 50 arrests across 7 countries. And I know, Earl, he is a garbage person, and he really doesn't deserve any breath being wasted on him. But there is so much about him that is so wild, and I think it's a little important to go over again for full clarity on what a monster this guy is and how it doesn't make any sense that he wasn't arrested until 2003. When he was arrested, initially, he was like, yeah, I was going to sleep with Brenda, but like, I was going to force her into anything if she didn't want to, which later turned into this really fun story of him saying something like, well, I knew the whole time that I was talking to the FBI, and I was just so sick of what I had been a part of, and I wanted to take those guys down from the inside, and I wanted to help put them behind bars or some garbage like that. And that's not the exact quote, but that's the gist of what he was trying to use as his defense later on. Like, he really tried to take credit as if he helped put all of those other people behind bars. Like, he had been a part of that. It was something that he wanted to do, something he was willingly a part of. And he was really acting like he couldn't just go to the police if he felt that way. Like, he had to spend actual months to invite the FBI over, which I feel like the same thing with Brooks, where it's like, why would anyone believe this? Especially when there's so much evidence to show that's not what happened at all. But he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for all of this, with parole eligibility being set that he would be able to be released after serving 8.5 years. He really didn't have the best life, right? He had some problems growing up. He had a rough childhood, but, later in life, he got lucky. Like, this wasn't even his first time that he was arrested for stuff with minors. When he was serving in the U.S. Air Force, back in 1980, he had been dishonorably discharged after he sexually assaulted 4 girls between the ages of 7 to 11 that he was babysitting while stationed overseas in Germany. After that, he had been released early on parole in 1985, only 5 years after the offenses happened. Then 3 years after he was released, in 1988, he returned to where he was born and raised, St. Louis. But he wasn't even in St. Louis long before there was a time in 1989 and 1990 when he lucked out again after he assaulted 2 other girls in Overland, Missouri, while he was still on parole. But this case ended up getting dismissed because the girls were deemed too young to give testimony and they were unable to stand trial. But, this time around, his luck really did run out. As Cox was getting ready to be released on his parole in September of 2011, only a few months earlier, under the Adam Walsh Act, Cox was deemed a sexually dangerous person, meaning that he was going to be held in custody even after completing his criminal sentence. And that's an indefinite hold. It is something that can be fought, but it's like there's no release date set for it. At this time, he was just in prison with no outlook of getting out. And this is going to move us to 2018. There had been some advances in forensics and DNA technology between 1993 and 2018. So the police had decided to re-examine the evidence in Angie's case. And during that examination, they had found some DNA that was undiscovered before. And with the advancements in forensics, they were able to actually get a profile from this DNA, which is when they found their prime suspect. And even better, they had plenty of time to get everything together and build a case to charge him with murder without the weight of a possibility that he could be hurting anyone else, because their suspect was none other than Earl Cox. So 25 years after Angie had disappeared, charges for her murder were finally announced in 2019. In this press conference, the police had also mentioned that they were expecting someone else to be involved in the crime based off the information that they had obtained. And once they got Cox transferred to Missouri, he eventually did confess to the murder, But in his confession, he did claim that he had been driving down the road and had some car trouble. So he pulled over for a few moments and noticed a school bus driving by. A few moments after that, he had noticed Angie walking down the street. When she was close enough, he asked if she had been hungry, and when she said yes, she willingly got into his car and they went to Burger King and then drove around for a while before he took her back to his mobile home where he was staying and locked her in a back bedroom. He had also claimed at the time of his arrest that he couldn't remember how long he kept her, but he had no trouble remembering all of the awful details of what he did to her. And these details were never publicly released, which honestly, it's probably a good thing. I mean, there was a family member that had said not knowing what happened to Angie felt like torture, but it really was better not knowing, because after hearing what Angie had gone through, it was just horrible. The absolute worst thing for her and her family to hear. I mean, even the judge on the case had said that a parent's worst nightmare couldn't imagine what Cox had done to her. And there were more people that had come forward after the announcement of his arrest, alleging that they were abused by him as well. But he had died in prison before any other charges could be brought against him, other than those overland assaults that I had mentioned. Now, my theory, and you can tell me your theories, I'd love to hear it, but I do think that it's possible that Cox had someone else with him on this. I think that deathbed confession could be very real. I think especially if the police are expecting there to be somebody else involved, I think he would be the best suspect for it. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he had said in his deathbed confession had been true, but they couldn't verify anything with Angie. They had no idea who his friend could have been that he had kidnapped Angie with. Squires and Cox, they were around the same age. They were about 2 years apart in age, as well as, and I should have jumped into this earlier with the deathbed confession, but during that confession, Squires had said that him and a man had held her for several days after the kidnapping, and when they were leaving her in the woods, they were scared off by somebody passing by, which I think is also if they had been talking to that teenager from the high school to assist with them. The area that they were leaving her in was an area that was frequented by high schoolers to go and drink underage and stuff. So it could be very likely that somebody had seen something, seen a car driving off and just didn't see Angie in the woods, didn't know what was going on, or maybe it was driving around that time. I think it's very likely that something like that could have happened, which is why they had a kid assisting them. They did hold her for several days, but that was public knowledge. But I think another thing that really stands out to me is that the nurse didn't contact the police because of what she was told was done to these girls couldn't have been real. It was too horrible to believe. And you're hearing this from Angie's family, and even the judge is speaking out on it, that a parent's worst nightmare couldn't imagine the things that they've done. It's so horrible. And maybe that's just a verbiage that people are using to describe stuff, but I feel like it's very much related. Although I know in all of the psychology tests that they had done for Earl when he was civilly committed, a lot of them said he was very paranoid and had some trust issues. But I feel like something like that really could have stemmed from Squires kind of ratting him out. I mean, that was around 1997 that the news had come out that there was that false confession. And that's also around the time that Earl estimates he started using the dark web site that he was administrating. And he was attempting to use that in a way of abstaining from being disgusting. So yeah, I think it's very likely that Squires was related to this. I do also think that, because I know that even people talking about this is like, oh, this is so happenstance, right? Like he was having car trouble. She just so happened to be pulling up on the bus at the same time he was having car trouble. And it just worked out this way to where it was a perfect opportunity for him. He got so lucky, and I just have trouble believing that. I do believe that he got very lucky with not anyone in the neighborhood that day, but if you remember, there was a sketch released for somebody that had been driving around that area before Angie had gone missing. And not only that is Cox's sister lived very, very close to where Angie lived. I mean, Cox even at some point was living like 2 or 3 streets away from where Angie lived. So he was in that area. I think it's very likely that he had seen Angie or seen kids on that street and did target them. And I think that it's very possible that he had been driving around that area for a while, waiting for the perfect opportunity to pick somebody up when there were less kids around. Also with that, I mean, I just think it's a little unrealistic. Like, I've never had car trouble and pulled over to the side of the road or something and then just looked at my car for like 5 minutes and been like, okay, it's fine, I could leave now. Like, I'm like looking into that. Like, I want to know what the heck is going on. And he did siding. Okay, he worked on the houses and stuff. He wasn't a mechanic. He doesn't know anything about cars from what I know. I don't actually know if he knows anything about cars. He could have learned stuff like that, but I just don't really think it's possible that he was like having all this car trouble where he had to pull over on the side of the road, especially when his sister lived so close by. If it was something very minor, like he could have just gone to his sister's house and checked on his car there. It feels unnecessary to be pulling over on a street in a neighborhood unless there's something big going on with the car. But if there was something big going on with the car, why are you leaving 5 minutes later with the little girl? I just don't think this was an opportunity attack. I think it was targeted. I think that he is a monster, and I think that he was seeking somebody out at this time. I have very little doubt that that wasn't the case. Although with Squires, I'm unsure. I don't know where I fall on that. If I think that he was there that day, if he had just, been friends with Cox and was complicit in this and was part of what happened to Angie after the fact. I think that Cassie's case was absolutely an opportunity attack. I think Brooks had seen her walking down the street. He had work very, very soon after that. I mean, he was supposed to be at work, like basically when that had happened. So I really don't think that that was planned at all, but I just have a feeling that Angie's kidnapping was something a little bit more thought out and planned. But we'll move on from my theories because I'm sure that's not what everyone is here for. Well, Coxie was charged with the murder and kidnapping, but he died shortly after these charges came against him. He died in prison. So why did this take so long? And how was he able to evade the police? I mean, especially with the history he had. The first reason being, of course, that in 1993, police systems did not communicate the same way that they do now. Back then, specific information and files, they had to be sent over and shared directly with the other departments, whereas now police systems, they're digitalized and a lot easier to share and access across departments, which is something that could have helped tremendously with Angie's case. Cox had his name on a list of thousands of sex offenders in the area, and if they had that Overland report, the prosecuting attorney, Tim Lomar, had said that Cox would have been investigated and that he believed that if that had happened, if they had that information at that time, Angie's case might have been solved within weeks. And then, of course, the DNA advances, but it is something that's affecting a lot of older cases. I mean, advancements are really helping close previously unsolved or cold cases all the time. And the DNA that they were able to obtain of Cox's was from Angie's underwear, and it was on a part of the trim that had this pink dye, which back in 1993, even if they would have found that DNA, it wouldn't have been possible to test it because the dye, it would have acted as like an inhibitor, which would have caused issues with the DNA test performance where they wouldn't have been able to get a profile at all. It would have just come out inconclusive. And then, of course, he should be in jail, right? I mean, I think we could all agree on that. He had abused and been arrested for abuse on 4 children while he was in Germany, and then accused again while still on parole. And there is some good news with this, at least for the second part of that. There have been some implements into our justice system made specifically for children, where there's now a single liaison that they would talk to that helps build the case, ensuring that the information that comes forward is able to be taken to a trial, while also minimizing re-victimizing the children and having them recount over and over and over all these things to different people and what happened to them and what they were put through. It's very likely that if the same thing were to happen today, those charges never would have been dropped. They would have stuck and he would have been put back into prison. And lastly, for like big things that have changed since then, I did want to touch base on that Adam Walsh Act. I think it is so important. I think it is such an important act that was put through. That's what allowed Cox to be held in prison after his scheduled release in 2011. But there is a bit that goes into having someone deemed sexually dangerous under this act. In court, it has to be proven that the offender has engaged or intended to engage in sexually violent crimes or child molestation, that they have a serious mental illness, abnormality, or disorder, with the third and final point being to prove that they would have serious difficulty refraining from sexually violent conduct or child molestation. Essentially proving that if this person were released, they would continue to be a threat to society, which, based on Earl's history, he absolutely was. But if all three of these things are able to be proven under the Walsh Act, it allows for indefinite civil confinement. Also with this act, although not really relevant to this case, it does have some really great immigration provisions on it. Like if there's a permanent resident that has offenses against minors like sexual misconduct, false imprisonment, or kidnapping, they can be barred from sponsoring family members from coming over to the States. So really, it's to protect the people outside of our borders from being pulled into the States and then stuck in an awful situation like that. And I mean, there are some more provisions with it that make it more of like a process for convicted child offenders outside of the U.S. to immigrate here. But we won't really get into all of that. I just thought that the first part with, even trying to make sure that these people can't get a hold of kids outside of the States is really, really great. So I think the Adam Walsh Act is definitely going in the right direction. They're even working to try to make it to where there is heavier sentence, even for first offenses against minors. So you're not seeing things like with Cox's first case, where he was sentenced 8 years when he was looking at a maximum of 68 years. But to close this out, I would like to talk a little bit about Angie and Cassie, their families, and the impact that I could find on them. There was a family member of Angie's that had said that after Cox's arrest, it didn't bring them any closure, saying as long as there are people like that out in the world, there can never be closure. Angie's mom, Diane, she had been impacted deeply by this. She had fallen into a deep depression after Angie had been found, and she was never the same after. I mean, she was going to therapy and support groups. And still, there was a time at one point where she had tried to take her own life. And she had also reached out to psychics after the investigation slowed down, hoping to get some information, some closure on what happened to her daughter. And it really broke her spirit when one of them had told her that Angie's killer would never be found. Which, to be fair, they were partially right for Diane, since she had passed away from cancer in November of 2016. So she never got to see Earl get arrested. There was also Angie's biological father, D'Angelo. Angie was named after him. He was very excited. She was his only daughter. And like I mentioned earlier, he wasn't allowed to have a relationship with her. But he was really hoping that after she turned 18, he'd be able to build a relationship with her and become a big part of her life. It is something that he had been looking forward to. And I mean, a lot of his family felt the same way. They had talked about how they had years and years of birthday cards, Christmas cards, gifts for every occasion, just so she would know how much they were thinking of her and wishing they could be around her and celebrate those occasions with her. And they never got that opportunity to give that to her. Her stepfather, Ron, he had become very overprotective with her siblings, going as far as he would get in his car and follow her brother around as he rode his bike outside. Her brother had even told this story about how he had been riding his bike around and a neighbor had pulled up to him and was like, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help? There's this car following you." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm fine. It's just my dad." It was such a normal thing for him. And I mean, that makes so much sense, right? It has to be so hard to learn how to allow your kids to be alone and have that independence and freedom after something like this. And as far as Cassie's family goes, there's really not a lot of information out there. I couldn't find anything else about Rhonda or Cassie's dad, and I really looked hard for it. It seemed like with Angie's case remaining unsolved, Cassie kind of became this other girl who was just killed So much so that it seems like in a lot of articles, she ends up being this footnote in a conversation about Angie. Briefly mentioned that another girl had been killed, but it turned out not to be related. And then on to the bigger story and the timeline of events. And I get it. With all the speculation for months that these crimes had been tied together, that this was a serial killer, it's really hard to talk about either of the cases without a mention of the other. I mean, especially with Angie's case, because there was that whole idea it's a serial killer, and then we don't know who it is, and who knows what's going on, and this person's not found for years and years. There was a lot more mystery with it, and it had gone on a lot longer. There's all this, like I said, all this question of who did this, where are they, what is happening, but it feels so bad to me, because Cassie, she's more than just a victim. She's more than just this other girl. She loved her church. She loved her family. She loved her friends. She was excited to go to school and learn. She was always so cheerful and smiling at her neighbors whenever she passed them on the road. And it really feels like she was looked over after everything was concluded with her investigation. But the both of them, I mean, they're outgoing, friendly children. And although we don't get to know them in a more personal sense, especially with Cassie, there's a lot unknown with who she was and what she liked and what she wanted to do. But I know it's like this with plenty of other cases. And I just think it's important to remember these girls, they're real. This isn't just entertainment. This is remembrance in the form of a horror story of the absolute tragedy that life is. They deserve to be talked about. They deserve to be remembered. And they deserve to have pieces of them remain in the hearts of people who didn't even know them. They had so much more ahead of them, a whole life of things that they never get to experience. There were people whose lives they could have had big impacts on in their journey through their own life, and they never even got to meet them. Friends and family that lost every single future moment they could have had, and who knows what they could have turned into. What they could have done with their life and brought into this world. It is tragic, and they deserved more. They deserved better. I really appreciate you staying here until the end. I know this has been a really long case, so I'm so glad that I was able to share this with you. I really appreciate you staying here till the end, and I hope that I get to talk to you in another one. But until then, be safe.